Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. There's nothing that packs them in like pensions taxation. It's fantastic to see such a big group of people here today, and such a high-quality group as well. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. We've been working on pensions and tax and pensions taxation at the IFS for a long time, and this report is a further step, I hope, in the direction of trying to move the debate onto a more rational basis and hopefully get some sensible change. You can always hope. I'm Paul Johnson, I'm director of the IFS, and I'm simply here to chair this event. One small piece of housekeeping is there is going to be a poll. You're going to be asked a question, and we want you to vote on that question. If you go to the Slido app and put in the hashtag IFS code, I think it will be feasible to vote in that. Carl or Isaac will explain better when they get up to ask the question. So do be ready for the excitement of an IFS poll. Just a couple of words of introduction. First of all, of course, huge thanks to the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust for funding this work. And secondly, particularly to David Gauke and Josephine Cumbo, who are joining our panel after Carl Emerson and Isaac Delestre, my colleagues, present the results of what's been a pretty substantial project, which has resulted in, you've got the very short summary in your hands. There's a much longer report on the website, which I expect you to all go home and read as soon as this is over. We've got a total of an hour and a half in here, and then we have the excitement of some drinks, which are more than tea and coffee, but hopefully wine and beer, upstairs from 5:30. I'm told that we have to stay here till 5:30 because the drinks definitely won't be ready before then. So we're going to hold you here for the next hour and a half, whether you like it or not. I will stop at that point. I will hand over to Carl, and I won't pop up again until after David and Joe have spoken. We'll then have a sort of panel discussion and questions from you.
Thank you, Paul. So in terms of the polling, what we'd be quite interested in is for people to go there now and vote for what they would like to see as their preferred or set of preferred reforms to the pensions tax regime, and then we can compare them to what we're going to say we think a good set of reforms would be. So please do get voting. So in my presentation, I'm going to go through some of the context, the background. I'm going to describe how the UK pensions tax regime works at the moment, the approach we took to this project, how generous we might think that system is relative to a couple of benchmarks. I'm then going to set out one of the reforms that we're not proposing in our report and explain why. I'll then hand over to Isaac, who's going to take you through the reforms that we are recommending. So let's just start with a little bit of context. I suspect a lot of this will be known to people in this room. Firstly, membership of workplace pensions. So if we look at employees, what's been happening to their membership with pensions, and here we essentially have quite a good news story. If you go back to 2012, about half of employees were members of a workplace pension scheme. Membership was declining. Because of automatic enrolment, which was gradually phased in after 2012, membership increased dramatically, and it currently stands at about 80% of employees. And if you look at the target group for automatic enrolment, it's as high as 90%. So we've got many more people contributing to pensions now than a decade ago. Now, those people haven't been brought into defined benefit arrangements. Membership of those has been pretty flat over the last decade. There's a few in the private sector, but the vast majority of public sector workers are in these schemes. So all of that growth that you see in membership of workplace pensions has been in defined contribution schemes. That's where you see the big increase since automatic enrolment in 2012. Now, nothing intrinsically wrong with defined contribution schemes, but they clearly do have different risks that individuals face. They also have different amounts tend to be going in them. So what you might be worried about is the fact that if you take people who are in a DB scheme, actually in the most recent year of data, 87% of them got an employer contribution worth more than 12% of their salary. Whereas if you look at people in a DC plan, 9% are getting an employer contribution worth more than 12% of their salary. So we might have done pretty successful reform in terms of getting people into these pensions, but clearly some concerns that there are many people out there who are not saving very much in them. That's the situation for employees. They're not the only group that policymakers are worried about. We also have the self-employed, growing number of people self-employed in the UK, and a dramatic fall in their participation in pensions over the last 20 years. If you go back to the late 1990s, about 1 in 2 self-employed was saving in a private pension. Roll forward to 2018, it was about 1 in 6. So a big fall in participation there. So another big background factor here has been what's been happening to returns on different investments that people can make. So for this chart, what I'm going to do is show you for different dates of birth from 1930 through to 1985. I'm going to answer the question, well, what's the average annual return you would get from an investment that you made at the age of 22 if you then held that asset up to age 65 or to date if you haven't got to 65 yet. So we'll start with growth in house prices, and UK house prices have delivered pretty good returns for many of these generations, but you can see that those returns have been much lower for those reaching age 22 in recent years. It's not just about housing though. We can look at equities, returns there much lower than what they were for earlier generations. And we can also look at bonds where again returns are lower than what they have previously been. So an economic environment where it might be harder for more recent generations to accumulate assets. And we can look directly at that by looking at the wealth holdings of different generations. So on this chart, I'm going to show you the average holdings, the median level of household wealth for people born in different decades by their age. So the line here on the right is people born in the 1920s, then people born in the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s. And there's two things going on that you can see in this chart. One is that households on average accumulate resources until they reach roughly retirement age, and then they run those resources down through retirement. The second thing you can see is that for these generations, each subsequent generation seems to have managed to get more wealth at the same age as the generation that went before it. Now, unfortunately, that no longer looks to be the case. The evidence suggests that people born in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s don't seem to be on a trajectory which is going to lead to them having more wealth. Now, that's perhaps because they're getting less access to DB pensions, because they're finding it harder to get on the housing ladder, and because of those returns on that last slide being less favourable to them, plus the weak earnings growth we've seen in the period since the mid-2000s. So that's all the backdrop to this, and it's an important backdrop because when thinking about how we might change the taxation of pensions, we need to think about how it might affect different generations. So what approach did we take in this project? Well, when we look at the tax system as a whole, we tend to look at taxes, we tend to think about how they sit in that system, and we tend to think what would a tax look like that would be that would do as least distorting as possible. What would a neutral tax look like? Now, of course, with the pensions regime, you're deliberately trying to encourage and support pension savings. So you don't want a system which is completely neutral. You do want to have some subsidies in it. And what we're not doing in this project is taking a stance on whether the overall level of tax subsidy the government's providing is the right level. We're not making a judgment over whether that level should be higher or whether it should be lower overall. And what we're also not doing is looking at the tax system and saying, should the overall tax system be more or less redistributive to different groups? That's not the objective of this study. Rather, what we've done is we've looked at where do the current tax subsidies go? And in particular, are there places where they look like they might be ungenerous to those who may be at more risk of undersaving for retirement? And are there places where the current tax subsidies are overly generous to those who don't look particularly at risk of undersaving for retirement? And where we see those features, what we do is we propose reforms that would even out those subsidies. And in particular, we're also interested in trying to introduce reforms that would deliver a system where the incentives to save in a pension are not oddly linked to specific rates in the tax system. So it no longer would be the case that how much incentive you have to save in a pension depends on what the basic rate of income tax is or what the employee rate of national insurance is. And an advantage of that is you don't have your pension incentives changing just because policymakers come along and change the general tax system. And it would give policymakers better tools to make subsequent adjustments. They could change income tax rates and national insurance rates without affecting pension subsidies, Or if they wanted to make pension subsidies more or less generous, they could do that without changing the overall general tax system. We also set out in our reforms, put a lot of thinking into making sure that our reforms are practical, and in particular a focus on making sure that they would work for both defined benefit and defined contribution arrangements. Now, you might say, well, surely it really matters if they work for defined contribution arrangements. Defined benefit arrangements, particularly in the private sector, are pretty scarce. Well, it's still the case that 30% of employees are in a defined benefit arrangement. And actually, if you're thinking about upfront income tax relief, slightly more of that relief goes to contributions to defined benefit schemes than to contributions into defined contribution arrangements. So it really does matter if you're thinking about income tax relief in particular, getting a system that works well for both DB and DC arrangements. There's also a whole load of transitional issues, which clearly require careful consideration. We've done quite a lot of thinking about how our reforms could be phased in gradually, perhaps by date of birth. But there would also need to be more consideration. There's ultimately some political judgments there to make. What I'd highlight here is that when you're making the tax treatment of money that's already been saved in a pension harsher, that's retrospective taxation, but it's difficult to avoid that unless you're going to have an extremely long transition. Unless you're prepared to say, my reform is only going to apply to people aged under 16 today, you're going to have to accept some degree of retrospection if you're going to increase the tax on anything that affects pension saving that's already taken place. And I think what you're really left with is a trade-off. To what extent are you satisfied that your reforms will affect people who might have saved in a pension, perhaps with the expectation that the tax system would have been more generous than it will be when they get to retirement, versus to what extent are you content to let overly generous elements of the system linger for longer? And if you do that, of course, it's on average going to benefit older generations at the expense of generations that follow them. And that is a trade-off that needs to be made. So let's look at the current system. Let's look at how it supports pension saving and how that's distributed. So when you're thinking about the saving in pensions, or indeed any savings vehicle, and you're thinking about tax design, there's three natural points at which you can consider applying tax. You can look at when contributions are made. Should they come out of income where tax has already been levied, or should they be made out of income before any tax has been levied? What about the returns that accrue on the assets? Should they be subject to tax or not? And what about when money comes out of the pot? Should that be taxed at that stage or not? So at each three of these points, you have a decision whether to tax or whether to leave it exempt, T or E. Now, I wouldn't recommend that we try and do taxed. If we did that, I think people would probably decide to take their money and leave it under their bed in cash. But you do have a choice over whether to tax or exempt at each individual stage. So what do we do in the UK? Well, if you talk about saving in ISAs or owner-occupied housing, that's subject to a regime which is taxed, exempt, TEE. So you have some income, it would be subject to income tax. You might then choose to buy, say, an owner-occupied house. If that shoots up in value, those returns are not taxed. If you sell that house and then spend the money, there's no tax on that withdrawal. If you look at the income tax treatment of pensions, that's closest to the opposite way round, exempt, taxed, EET. The money goes into the pension, at least up to a limit, free of income tax. Again, there's no attempt to tax those returns as they accrue. When the funds are withdrawn, in most cases, some of those funds at least would be subject to income tax. And both these benchmarks, this kind of ISA treatment TEE or this pure EET treatment, can be considered reasonable benchmarks for how we might tax saving. Now, there's three key differences between them. The most obvious, perhaps, is the timing of tax payments. In a TEE arrangement, you collect your tax revenue up front. In an EET arrangement, you get it backloaded. And I think in terms of pensions, that's an advantage of an EET system. Why do I think that? Well, imagine we're in a situation where you have a particularly large cohort, aging, reaches retirement, starts to draw on their pensions. That's precisely the moment in time they'll put more pressure on the state pension, on the NHS, on long-term care. So it's kind of good that the government's collecting more tax revenue from them at that point in time. It makes the management of the public finances just that little bit easier. There's some other differences as well. One that's often highlighted is that if your tax rate's different when you make your contributions to when you withdraw the funds, you can do better or worse under one of these arrangements. And in particular, you can have people who perhaps pay higher rate tax when they're working, they save in a pension at that point. When they get to retirement, maybe they're a basic rate taxpayer, so they'll do better under an arrangement which allows them to be taxed EET, to pay the tax when they're a basic rate taxpayer rather than when they're a higher rate taxpayer. And I'll come back to that at the end of this talk. Another difference, which is a bit more subtle, is about what happens if people get different returns. Imagine you're someone that gets really big returns on your pension. You put a lot of effort into it, you're skillful at it, or you're just lucky. Well, you'd rather have a TE arrangement because then all of those returns would be untaxed. An advantage of an EET arrangement, one that collects the tax at the end, is if you get lucky or if you're particularly skillful at investing your pension, yes, you'll get a bigger pension as a result, but you'll also share those spoils with society through higher taxes too. So how does our current system compare to those benchmarks? Well, it's closest, as I say, to an EET arrangement, so it seems natural to compare it to that. And there are some differences. In particular, there are some subsidies, and for good reason, because we think the system should offer some subsidies. The first and perhaps the most high profile is the fact that up to a quarter of an accumulated pension can be withdrawn completely free of income tax. So a quarter of your pension is not EET, it's actually EEE, very generous treatment. There are some exceptions. Supposing you're making employee pension contributions or supposing you're self-employed and you're saving in a pension, well, that money will go into a pension after national insurance has been paid. And there's no national insurance charged on your pension withdrawals. So your national insurance treatment for individual contributions is TEE. But actually a lot of people get their employers to make contributions on their behalf. In fact, that's the majority of contributions being made in the UK, and they're very generously treated by national insurance. There's no employee or employer's national insurance on the way into the pot, and there's no employee or employer's national insurance when the money is subsequently withdrawn. So those contributions escape NICs entirely, EEE treatment. We also treat pension pots very generously at death. If you die with some money left in your pension pot, in most cases that can escape inheritance tax. And if you die before the age of 75, there's no income tax placed on any of the withdrawal of the funds either. And then finally, and something which makes the system unambiguously less generous than a pure EET system, is that there are some limits on the extent to which you can put money in a pension. So there are annual limits on how much you can contribute, and there's also lifetime limits on how much you can accumulate in total. So who's gaining under these relative to a EET arrangement? Well, I think it's pretty clear that the first four of these are going to be of more benefit to people who've got big pension pots, people who've got high retirement incomes. Don't forget that tax-free lump sum, that's more valuable if you're a higher rate taxpayer in retirement than if you're a basic rate taxpayer. And it's going to be more generous to those who are getting big employer contributions. Now, it's not clear to me that those are the kind of groups you'd focus on if you're worried about those individuals who are at risk of undersaving for retirement. Okay, so as you'd expect, IFS has done some empirical analysis to try and look at the effect of different systems on individuals. How we've done that is to try and look at the long-run effect, taking into account both the tax an individual pays up front when money goes into a pension, but also the tax they'll ultimately pay when they get to retirement. We do this by looking at current workers in the current tax and benefit system, along with a model of what the tax rate they will face in retirement might be. We set out all of these assumptions in a lot of detail in the full report. The advantages of the model is it allows us to set out who would win and lose under different reforms. It provides lots of insights into how the system's working. Naturally, we have to make a whole load of assumptions, and I think one I want to particularly highlight is that we're not taking into account behavioural responses here. We're essentially assuming the total amount going into pensions won't change as a result of these reforms. Okay, so let's start by thinking about what if we wanted to compare the current, we wanted to move to a TE system. Now, I'm not recommending this at all. I just want to say how much harsher would the system treat people, or more generously would it treat people, compared to the current system we have. So if we tried to tax all the money when it goes into a pension and then not tax it again, how would things change? And I'm going to show this both overall, but also by the decile of where people are in the earnings distribution, from the poorest on the left up to the richest on the right. So if we move to a TEE system, the first thing that would obviously happen is we collect a whole load more income tax up front. All of that money flowing into pensions would be immediately subject to income tax when it went in. higher earners would see the biggest tax rise because they put more into pensions. They also tend to pay higher rates of income tax, so they would lose the most from that part of the reform. We would also stop taxing, stop applying income tax to any withdrawals from pensions. So there'd be a tax cut that people would get on their pension withdrawals in retirement. We would also start levying some more national insurance contributions, because in a pure TEE system, we would look at those employer contributions to pensions and we would make them subject to both employer NICs and employee NICs. So this is how a TEE system would compare to our current system. The yellow dots here show you the net effect of that. You can see that our system is much more generous than this. This TEE system implying a tax rise on average of over 5% of people's earnings, and it's benefiting higher earning deciles more than middle or lower earning deciles. But that's just one way of looking at it. An alternative is to say, well, what happens if we move to a pure EET system? So let's supposing now we say we're going to give relief on everything that goes into pensions, but we're going to fully tax everything when it comes out. How much more or less generous would the system be then? Well, if you move to that system, the first thing you need to do is start charging national insurance on pension income. You'd want to tax it fully on the way out, so you'd want to be levying both employee and employer national insurance contributions on pension income. You'd also want to be getting income tax on the whole of pension withdrawals, so that tax-free lump sum would go, so you get a bit more income tax in retirement too. You'd be giving more upfront relief though, because the self-employed and people making employee contributions, you'd be giving them upfront relief against their employee and their employer's national insurance contributions. What would the net effect be? Well, overall, the system wouldn't look that much different in terms of its generosity to what we have. The biggest losers from moving to this system on average would be the top two deciles of the earnings distribution. And actually middle earners would, if anything, be slightly better off under this pure system. So this is saying relative to this benchmark, on average, they're not really getting much of a subsidy for their pension saving. And that's what's motivating much of the reforms that Isaac's going to speak about. But before I hand over to Isaac, what I want to do is just talk through the one of the reforms that we are not recommending, and that's a reform to the upfront income tax relief. I want to talk about that because lots of proposals are put forward to reform income tax relief, and I want to set out why we're not doing that. And I think the first point to make here is that it's very important not to think about money going into pensions in isolation. You also need to consider the tax that's levied on the subsequent withdrawals. It's the combined effect of both that matters. Is it unfair to allow people who are higher rate taxpayers in working life but draw their pensions at basic rate in retirement? It's not obvious to me that that is unfair. If you think our income tax system really should be trying to get at people's lifetime incomes, you might think it's fundamentally unfair that two individuals with the same lifetime income, but one who's got a stable income, will pay less in income tax than the one whose income varies from year to year, because we have an annual income tax system that is progressive. So if you think that that's unfair and you want to tax people according to their lifetime income, well, allowing smoothing of taxable income would reduce the extent to which our annual income tax system is punishing those with variable incomes. You might think of it as a good thing. Now, there is a counter-argument to that. Not everybody can take advantage of such smoothing. You might worry about the unfairness between those who can and those who cannot smooth. So it's true to say that there are competing inequities here. I think for those who don't like tax rate smoothing, I'd point out that actually at the moment at least, it's not just higher and additional rate taxpayers who are benefiting from tax rate smoothing. There are a whole load of people who are getting basic rate relief on their pension contributions, who when they get to retirement don't pay any income tax on at least part of their pension withdrawals. If you like smoothing, you'd say, well, that's perfectly reasonable. If you don't like smoothing, then presumably you wouldn't like that either. So actually an argument for flat rate relief, I think, also actually implies a flat rate income tax on pension withdrawals, which I haven't seen people propose. So that's the kind of in principle arguments. There's also a very practical argument against trying to restrict income tax relief. And it's because when money goes into a defined contribution pension, or where an individual's making a pension contribution, it's easy to assign that contribution to an individual, to value it, and say, right, we want to charge you income tax up front on that. But when an employer is making contributions to a DB scheme, it's not clear which individuals those contributions relate to. And it matters because you need to know if you're assigning them to basic rate or higher rate taxpayers. So to give you a concrete example, supposing the retired members of a DB scheme start living longer, so that employers got to put more into the scheme. If you want to restrict relief, you need to put some income tax on that money. But who should be charged the income tax? Charging it on current workers who are members of the scheme might not seem like the obvious thing to do. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Isaac now, who's going to talk you through the things that we are proposing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. So Carl's given you some context, he's given you some principles, and he's told you about the reforms we're not going to be proposing in today's report. Now, what I'm going to do now is get into the nitty-gritty of the reforms we are going to be proposing. Now, there are 5 key areas where we think the system is in need of reform. The first is the 25% tax-free component. Next is national insurance, and that's both employee and employer national insurance. We've then got the treatment of pensions at death, the tax treatment at death. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about pension limits. Now, as Carl's told you, all but the last of these essentially constitute the current system of pension subsidy in the UK. And as Carl said, there are perfectly reasonable reasons why we might want to subsidise pensions for those who we might think are at risk of undersaving. But what I'm going to be telling you is that the current system is often targeting those subsidies at people who aren't really at risk of undersaving, is often missing out the very people we might worry about the most in terms of undersaving. And so the package of reforms we're going to be proposing is going to be looking to rebalance those incentives and to target them at those who need them the most. Okay, so let's start with the 25% tax-free component. Now, this is one of the longest standing, one of the best known elements of the pension tax system. As most people in this room will already know, it means that when you come to retire, you can take 25% of your pension pot out completely free of income tax. Now, we think that has some pretty serious design flaws. Now, the first is that if you've got a really big pension pot, so you've got 7, 8, 900,000 pounds in your pension, what this policy is essentially doing is that it's giving you a tax subsidy to put even more in your pension. Now, it's quite hard to understand why that would be a good use of money. If you've got that much in your pension, by definition, you're probably not at risk of undersaving. Now, another big problem with the current tax-free component is that it's most generous to those who are paying the highest rates of tax in retirement. So if you're an additional rate taxpayer, or if you're a higher rate taxpayer when you're a pensioner, then this tax exemption is worth a lot more to you than if you're a basic rate taxpayer. And even worse, if your income is so low in retirement that you're a non-taxpayer and you're paying no tax at all, well then this tax exemption is worth nothing to you at all. And these non-taxpayers, these people with the lowest incomes in retirement, are presumably exactly the people we should be worrying about the most in terms of undersaving. Okay, so what are we proposing to do about this? Well, one way in which you can think about the 25% tax-free component is that what the government's essentially doing is that it's topping up people's pensions in retirement. Now, the current system tops up the pensions of those with paying higher and additional rate tax by the most, and it doesn't top up the pensions of those who are non-taxpayers at all. So what we're proposing is to reform the tax-free component so that it tops up everyone's pensions by the same proportion as the current system tops up the pensions of basic rate taxpayers. Now, we think that would level out the current subsidy, and it would end this situation where those with the highest incomes in retirement get the biggest subsidy. Now, you'd still have the problem here that those with very large pensions would be being subsidised to put even more in those pensions. So what we're also recommending is that this reformed tax-free component should be capped. So you could cap it at, say, £400,000, and that would mean that it would only apply, the new tax-free component would only apply to the first £400,000 you save in your pension, and after that it would no longer apply. If you did set it at £400,000, that would only affect about 20% of pensioners. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is national insurance. Now, just a word of warning right off the bat. I'm going to be talking about employee pension contributions and employer pension contributions. I'm already getting confused. And then I'm also going to be talking about employee national insurance and employer national insurance. That obviously has the potential to get a bit confusing. I'm hoping this table is going to keep things nice and clear. So What the current system does is that it draws a big distinction between the treatment of employee pension contributions and employer pension contributions. So employee pension contributions have national insurance charged upfront. Employer pension contributions are entirely exempt from national insurance. Now, it's worth just pointing out that that's a massive tax subsidy, a tax subsidy of about £19 billion. To put that in context, it's roughly how much it would cost to cut the main rate of national insurance from 12% to 8% for everyone. And so while this doesn't get talked about as much as some other parts of the pension tax system, it's worth noting this is by far and away the biggest subsidy we give to pension saving in the UK. So we think that treatment of employer pension contributions is pretty flawed in a number of ways. Now, the first is that by tying the rate of subsidy to the rate of national insurance, as Carl said, you get this problem that if policymakers then change the rate of national insurance, well, then they're also changing the rate of subsidy. And one corollary of that, one flip side of that, is that where there are employers who don't pay national insurance, so for instance, very small employers who benefit from the employment allowance, well, then they're not going to benefit from the subsidy either. We also have the fact that because the subsidy is on employer pension contributions but not employee pension contributions, you get these pretty contorted arrangements where people try and make their employee pension contributions look like employer pension contributions through salary sacrifice and that kind of thing. And that's obviously just a big waste of everyone's time and effort, basically. Not to talk about anyone in this room. And also, clearly, by giving the subsidy on employer pension contributions, we're excluding from that subsidy anyone who doesn't have an employer. Notably, the UK's roughly 4 million self-employed. Okay, so what are we proposing to do about that? Well, what we're proposing to do for employee national insurance is that we're proposing to impose employee national insurance on pension income and provide employee national insurance relief at the point of contribution. And we could do that gradually by starting off providing the relief to everyone and then gradually phasing in the employee national insurance on pension income over time, maybe by date of birth. Now, this has a number of advantages. As Carl has already pointed out. So firstly, it would align the employee national insurance treatment with income tax treatment. Secondly, it would bring in revenue when you need it. So pensioners can be pretty expensive to the state. So if you have a tax that brings in lots of cash when you've got a lot of pensioners, that might be desirable. And also, it's going to ensure that those high investment returns don't escape tax. They're going to be subject to employee national insurance. There's also one other slightly more subtle feature of putting employee national insurance on pension income that's worth considering, and that's that it actually reduces the benefit you can get from smoothing your tax base over time as a higher rate taxpayer. So just to understand why that is, I'm showing you here the income tax schedule, just shows you how income relates to a given tax rate. Now, what a lot of people worry about under the current system is that you could get tax relief on your pension contribution at 40% if you're a higher rate taxpayer. And then if you're a basic rate taxpayer in retirement, you're only going to pay 20% on your income. Now, the big difference between income tax and employee national insurance is that while rates increase as income increases for income tax, that's not the case for national insurance. So for national insurance, when you get to the higher rate threshold, whereas income tax goes from 20% to 40%, national insurance goes from 12% to 2%. So when you combine the income tax and employee national insurance schedules, you get this. And as you can see, it's a bit flatter than the income tax schedule. And the result is that if you're a higher rate taxpayer contributing to a pension, you're going to get tax relief at 42%. But when you withdraw, you're only going to get taxed at 32%. So you can see the gap between those two is smaller than it is under the current system. So we're roughly halving the benefit that a higher rate taxpayer would get from smoothing their taxable income over time. Okay, so that's employee national insurance. What about employer national insurance? Now, you don't really have the option with employer national insurance of charging this on pension income for the very, not least because when it comes to the point when I retire, my employer may no longer exist, which I'm sure won't be the case with the IFS. So instead what we're proposing for employer national insurance is that this would be imposed upfront on pension contributions. Now, for employee pension contributions, that wouldn't be a change from the current system. For employer pension contributions, you'd be moving from a system where they're completely exempt from national insurance at the moment to a situation where they're being taxed up front. Now, that would obviously be a pretty big increase in tax on employer pension contributions and a big reduction in the subsidy. Now, we might worry that such a sudden reduction in the subsidy, such a large reduction in the subsidy might be too big, might reduce the amount of pension saving. And so what we're saying you could do is that you could also introduce at the same time a new subsidy on all employer pension contributions. Now, if you set that subsidy, say, at 13.8%, which is the employer national insurance rate, you would completely offset the additional tax that people would be paying from the fact that we're imposing employer national insurance upfront on pension contributions. The really big advantage, though, is that you'd be severing that link between the rate of national insurance and the rate of subsidy. So if in the future the rate of national insurance were to change, it's not going to change the rate of subsidy. And also, it's going to apply equally to all employers. So even those small employers who are currently not paying national insurance and so don't get the subsidy, they would benefit from this new subsidy. Okay, so how do the reforms I've spoken about so far look? Well, what I'm going to be showing you here is I'm going to be showing you how they would affect current workers. I'm going to be showing you how they would affect them both at the point where they're making their pension contributions now, but then also at the point where they withdraw those contributions in later life. And so on the horizontal axis, I'm going to have current workers sorted from the lowest income 10% to the highest income 10%, and then the vertical axis is going to be the change in tax liability as a share of income. So first off, there's going to be a tax increase across the board as a result of imposing employee national insurance in retirement. Then there's also going to be a tax reduction, which is going to be giving people employee national insurance relief when they contribute to their pension. You can see that's actually smallest right at the top of the income distribution, and that's because those top earners are actually only getting relief at that top 2% rate of national insurance. Then we can add on our reformed tax-free component, and you can see the net effect, which is the yellow line. And what you can see is that the package of reforms I've talked about so far is on average reducing tax for the bottom 80% of individuals here, the bottom 80% of workers rather. It's only really a substantial increase in tax for the top 10%. Okay, so before I move on to the next area of reform, I just want to take a quick step back and emphasize one of the things that I think is really important about the reforms I've set out so far, and that's we're going to be creating these new parameters in the tax system. So there's the reforms I've set out so far would create this new uniform rate of top-up as a result of our reformed tax-free component. It would also have this new cap on the tax-free component, and it would have this new direct subsidy for employer pension contributions. Now, the really nice thing is that these will now be the same for everyone under this reform system. You're not going to have this situation where the amount of subsidy you get depends on what tax rate you happen to be facing at a given time. Another nice thing is that this would then give control back to policymakers to be able to explicitly set the rate of subsidy where they want it to be. We're going to move away from this situation where the rate of subsidy gets arbitrarily altered every time politicians want to change the national insurance rate or the income tax rates. Okay, so taxation at death. This actually isn't something we discuss in today's report, but it's something we published a more in-depth report on a couple of months ago, so I urge you to have a look at that. It's cheery reading. So the context to be aware of here is obviously there's been, as Carl told you, a big growth in defined contribution pension wealth. And also in a post-pensions freedom world, we have a situation where people no longer have to buy an annuity with their pension. And so in the next couple of decades, we can expect to see far more people dying with unused pension wealth. And so how that gets treated for the purposes of inheritance becomes more and more important. Now, there are two things about the current tax treatment of pensions at death that we think are particularly undesirable. The first of those is that if you die before 75 and leave your pension to someone, they can withdraw all the income from that pension completely free of income tax. So if I die at 74 versus 75, that has enormous tax implications for whoever inherits my pension. That seems to us to be a pretty weird feature of the system, a pretty strange discontinuity, and we're recommending getting rid of it entirely. Now, the second element of taxation at death I'm going to talk about is inheritance tax. Now, pensions are currently entirely exempt from inheritance tax. And what that does is it creates this pretty bizarre set of incentives where pensions are essentially being treated more favourably as a vehicle for bequests by the tax system than they are as a vehicle for actually providing you with an income in retirement. That seems pretty odd, and we think that pensions should be subject to inheritance tax. They should be brought into the taxable estate. And it's important to say that we're not saying this because we think that inheritance tax should be higher or lower. We don't take a view on that. It would be completely reasonable to use any additional revenue you raise through this to either reduce the rate of inheritance tax or increase the threshold. All we're saying is that if inheritance tax exists, it should apply to all assets equally, including pensions. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about pension limits. So we think that the current limits have a few design flaws. Surprise, surprise. The first is that they're more generous to DB than DC pensions. They also have this strange taper in the annual allowance for very high earners, and that's pretty horribly complicated, and we've also seen that it can have some adverse consequences. So where you have, we saw recently with GPs found themselves bumping up against this taper, facing very high marginal rates of tax. And also, these features create quite a lot of uncertainty and complexity. There's a lot of worrying about whether you'll end up going over the limit, whether your investment returns will take you over, and also with DB pensions, it can vary quite a lot as the calculation changes the amount of wealth you have in there. So we're recommending the following reforms. We're saying there should be a new lifetime allowance that limits total contributions to defined contribution pensions, but that limits benefits for defined benefit pensions. And we also think we should get rid of the taper to the annual allowance. Now, we think both of these things would represent pretty significant simplifications to the current system, which in this area is pretty complicated. We also think that, contingent on the other reforms that we're recommending in this report, you could also probably afford to make the annual and the lifetime allowances a little more generous, particularly as you've got rid of some of the areas where the system is currently overly generous to those who maybe have high incomes or very large pensions. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off with a few conclusions. So I hope what I will have convinced you of is that the current system is full of some pretty odd incentives, that it's sometimes giving the largest subsidies to those who seem to need them the least, who seem to be least at risk of undersaving, and often failing to give subsidies to those who we might think are most at risk of undersaving. So we think this is a practical package of reforms, and we think it achieves a number of things. We think that, firstly, it evens out these incentives to save in a pension. It stops this situation where it's just a function of whatever tax rate you happen to be facing. It hands the power to set the subsidy explicitly back to policymakers so that those levels of subsidy can be set not as the arbitrary consequence of changes to income tax rates or national insurance rates. It ends this bizarre set of incentives created by inheritance tax treatment, and it does all that in a way that we feel generally rationalises the system. Okay, so I think that's everything from me. I'm going to hand back to Paul. Do I need to do anything for the Slido? Is there a... Yeah,
okay. Right, David.
Very good. Well, very good to be with you, and I'm delighted to be here. And I have to say, I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about, writing about, talking about the sort of political events of 2016 and the subsequent consequences of that. And here I am, for me, thinking about the political events of 2016, and of course I am referring to the fact that for the first 3 months or so of that year, and indeed for a few weeks of the previous year, those of us who were at the Treasury at the time immersed ourselves in the subject of pensions tax relief. And this is in truth a happier issue for me to talk about than the other events of 2016 that still continue to have an influence on our lives. And it was, I have to say, one of the most sort of fascinating periods for me as a minister. I did not know a huge amount about pensions tax relief as a policy. I'd been the Minister for Tax for some time, but I didn't know that much about pensions tax relief and the various options that were available there. Alongside other ministers and officials and special advisors, we went on a bit of a voyage of discovery. Of course, there were people inside Treasury and HMRC who knew a huge amount about pensions tax relief, but it was a bit of an exploration. And we devoted an extraordinary amount of time, meeting after meeting. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was in, hours-long policy meetings several times a week on this particular topic. It is a classic example of, what you end up with does not necessarily reflect all the work that goes in at the beginning, because we ended up with some relatively modest policy in terms of the introduction of lifetime ISAs. But we started off with a sort of general sense that maybe there is something a bit more that we could do better in terms of pension tax relief, how it is used, a sort of policy objective of trying to help people in retirement. Who are we trying to help? Is this the most effective way? Does it change behaviour in the way that we want it to? And a sense also that there was, quite a lot of money that was being used for this, and could it potentially be deployed in different ways that would be more effective and, let's be honest, more popular. And so we sort of started off not quite knowing where we wanted to go, but a sense that there was something really to look at. We had, of course, already made a number of what could be described as tactical changes to the pension tax relief system, in particular capping and limiting the use of lifetime allowances and the annual allowance. That had brought in really quite a lot of money in a very progressive way. Now, I am not going to sort of pretend that in terms of a piece of tax policy it was necessarily all the most elegant. Some of the least elegant things I think were still to come, but we had we had sort of explored that and gone really perhaps as far as we could have done. And if there is a sort of sense of sort of political karma, I subsequently, as the Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, had to deal with problems of recruitment of High Court judges because of the way that our tax system operated. And thankfully, the judges never realised that I was the cause of this problem, and was somewhat grateful that I was, to some extent, able to be the solution to that problem. And I kept quiet about my background here. So we were conscious that we had sort of got perhaps gone as far as we could have done in terms of reforms in this area. And then we were kind of left with three broad policy choices, the very broadest terms. One was, are there things that we could do to the existing system to improve it? And that is very much what we've got with this paper, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The very fashionable argument at the time was moving towards either capping at the basic rate or a flat rate tax relief. And then the third option, which was more radical, was looking at a TEE option combined, it should be noted, with some kind of matching system. And those were sort of broadly the three options. Now, when it came to the existing regime, The sort of most obvious place, I think, to start was the 25% lump sum. And a recognition that in terms of sort of coherence and logic, and for all the reasons that we have already heard this afternoon, was that it was not a brilliant policy. It was not well directed, and the logic behind it and so on was very questionable. But how to address it? There were, if you like, three interconnected concerns about it. The first is, this was the bit of the tax system that some of us felt that people did know and did sort of understand. And if we are trying to incentivize behaviour, addressing the bit that people kind of understood and thought was quite nice and really was perhaps changing their behaviour, we don't know, but perhaps was changing their behaviour, we thought, well, maybe that's a high risk. Connected with this is that we were pretty confident that the response of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph would not be universally positive, and that this would be seen as a sort of an attack on people's rights. And this then brings me to the sort of third element, which is touched on the report, and indeed we've heard earlier, is it retrospective? I very much sort of take the point that almost everything that we do, when we change rates of income tax or national insurance contributions, does that make income tax? Does that make it a retrospective change? But if you've got somebody who comes along and says, look, I have put this money into my pension because the deal was I was going to get 25% of it tax-free, then I feel aggrieved, and maybe I wouldn't have acted in that way, and I could have put the money in elsewhere. And I think there were genuine concerns that this creates legal risk. And then you're into the sort of situation of, well, so what are we going to do? Do we sort of start afresh? So you've got this kind of long tail. And that also raises another question. So that probably makes the political problem a little bit easier, the Daily Mail less angry, but you are still going to have something which is pretty provocative. And if you're only talking about future contributions, no contribution, nothing helpful on the scorecard whatsoever. This would be one where you would take a lot of political heat for benefits to the public finances some years down the line. Now, that shouldn't necessarily be dismissed. That's what happens when, for example, ministers announce that the state pension age is going up. And as the last minister to have done that, I survived. So it can be done. But it is requiring a little bit of sort of political bravery. So we didn't get that excited about it. I'm less clear, I confess, in my own mind on the various reforms that we've heard in terms of national insurance contributions, and particularly sort of employers' national insurance contributions. I think we felt that for us to put a very big tax increase on employers, it was some years past the 2010 election when we'd fought very hard on the jobs tax, but I think we felt a certain nervousness about going down that way. But I sort of make those points, and I'm not intending to be sort of too negative, but that was a sort of concern that we had about that. Flat rate tax, actually, I agree with the criticisms that have been made with that. The more we looked at it, the less attracted we became to it. I think to some extent, a flat rate tax sort of almost falls between two stools. I think there is a very reasonable argument to be made about income smoothing and why the sort of current regime is essentially defensible, that it is, that people say it's not as progressive as it might be, but I think it is broadly justified. I felt that if you were to go down the route of if you really wanted something that was very, very targeted at those who were at greatest risk of undersaving, the flat rate approach actually wasn't the be-all and end-all. It wasn't really the answer. There was a better answer, which was sort of matching and a TEE model and just to make the case for it. And I have to say, over time, I think as we explored it, we became more and more attracted to it at one level, which was, first of all, you have got quite a lot of the take back control. You've got quite a lot of power as ministers in terms of how you would use it. So, for example, if you really want to incentivize younger people to put money into a pension, you could have a more generous matching scheme for younger people. If you really want to get over the inertia of how do you get a pension policy and how do you start making contributions of any description, you could make it more generous for the first £100 or whatever. There was quite a lot of levers that could be used to change behaviour, so we thought that was attractive. There was the policy flexibility about it. Also, and this is a purely sort of behavioural point, well, what about the fact that it's easier to explain, isn't it? It's easier to understand. People know what ISAs are, but if you sort of say, right, you've kind of got an ISA, but for every £1 you put in, we are going to match you by a certain percentage, we thought that might be easier for people to understand and therefore influence behaviour. So we were quite attracted to all of that. Now, you will have noticed, though, we didn't introduce it. And there were a couple of problems I think we face with it. First of all, you've got to make sure that people fully trust you, that if it's if it's TEE versus broadly EET, well, bird in the hand and all of that, how can you be sure that it stays E at the very end? If you have got, if you've built up a really big pot, and people will say, well, isn't it wrong that these people have got really big pots? Shouldn't that be restricted? And we're sort of seeing a little bit of that on the debate on ISAs at the moment. So I think that was a problem. And also you needed a consensus. I mean, connected to this, you needed a consensus. And we may have had a bit of a consensus around the table in One Horse Guards Road, but that wasn't enough. We knew that the pensions industry would have been very hostile to it. We knew the pensions minister would have been very hostile to it. And it was my job to try to talk her around. I had the sort of title of the Ros Whisperer. But in a complete, humiliating failure in my career, she was not in any way convinced. So that was not going to sort of work terribly. And also to be very, open with you, this was in the run-up to a Brexit referendum when a sizable part of the Conservative Party were on a mission to destroy the reputation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Because they felt that was beneficial to their particular cause. And so putting out a controversial policy of this sort would have just been an open goal to those who wanted to do down George Osborne. So we didn't go down that route. And that's, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes how policy is and is not made. So it was a sort of fascinating area. I do think that for what I have seen, these are very, very sensible reforms if we're existing within the kind of current broad parameters, which is probably what we have to do. But we shouldn't underestimate that even there are still immense political challenges. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's always hard to follow up on David Gauke, and I wish I'd heard all of this gossip 6 years ago. Firstly, thank you to the IFS for inviting me to comment on your proposals, and I must say that it was really refreshing to open a report that didn't start simply with a call to scrap higher rate relief. In fact, the proposals in the report were almost mind-boggling in terms of the breadth and depth of thought that went into addressing the weaknesses and inconsistencies in the current system. So I think the IFS is to be congratulated for trying to shift the direction of the debate about pension taxation. Now, I tried to read the report through the eyes of an individual saver and a retiree. and how they would interact with these reforms. These are people who are generally and mainly confused about the complexity of the system, and let's face it, they have confidence that's been eroded by continual changes in the rules. And I also considered these proposals in context of the broader changes that are happening in people's lives in terms of tax and taxation systems. So my initial thoughts were the overall ambition of the report seems to try and allocate more fairly the overall tax incentives of the pension system, which is a very noble ambition. But the taxation of pensions is just one component of the overall tax system, as we know. And so while higher earners undoubtedly gain a significant share of overall pension tax relief under the current system, it's also the case that they pay a huge slice of tax receipts, including 73% of all income tax. And the tax system's definition of higher earner is also widening, giving frozen thresholds, with an estimated record 5.5 million people now paying 40% this tax year, which is a 15% increase in numbers over the prior year. So where fairness sits in the overall picture, as opposed to within the pension system, I would argue, is open debate and is subjective. So just moving on to the individual proposals, and I'm aware we're probably running over slightly, so I'll try and do a speed report. The tax-free lump sum, the Holy Grail, David was right to point out that they'd be loath to touch this. It would trigger the Daily Mail. And I agree with that. The readers, one thing about the tax-free lump sum, looping back to that report about complexity, people understand it. People know what it means, and because they get it, they know what it means to lose it. So I think anyone who was to try and tweak with the tax-free cash lump sum by capping it or changing the subsidy will face a backlash, let's face it, because in terms of the way people think of the tax-free lump sum, they use it to plan for things like paying off a mortgage, financing the divorce, or even helping the kids get on the property ladder. So if you were to change the way people think about that tax, that lump sum, you will be changing with financial planning, and that means it could cost people a lot of money. And it's also unclear how in applying changes to the tax-free lump sum might work in practice, how that transition would work. Those who have built up pensions under the existing system would presumably have tax-free entitlement honoured if the UK to a shift to an alternative framework, but this would create another layer of complex set of rules whereby those who have pensions already that have tax-free cash entitlements ring-fenced with new contributions moving to a different set of rules. You get the picture of what that might mean. So this could end up backfiring. It could discourage retirement saving. Let's face it, why would anyone want to lock their money away for 35, 40 years if this is happening? There's more complex. ISAs look more attractive from that point of view. So there could be unintended consequences. Turning to taxation on death benefits, and I also gasped when that rule, the age 75 rule, the whole thing was lifted with the pension freedoms, and it did make headline news. And I've always thought it's really odd thing to do to have this age 75 rule, but at the time I thought, if it's so generous, there's only one way that can go and get less generous. But unfortunately, you have reams, I'm talking about tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people who have transferred out of DB to DC, partly encouraged to do so by the fact that the tax treatment of DC pensions is far superior. So what is going to happen to those people who have done that if the rules change and that is made retrospective? Will they start suing their financial advisors? Will they start going to court? I mean, we've touched on this before, so I think it's an area where you have to tread very, very carefully. And the same thing goes for changes to inheritance tax generally. I think that would be hugely unpopular to bring pensions into scope of IHT when IHT is already hitting many, many more people. And I think politicians and David's former party colleagues would face a backlash from savers and retirees ahead of the next election if they tried to sort of move in that area. Now, the other, there are practical issues, again, similar to doing any changes which are retrospective, which one of them would be, if there is an immediate moving of the tax goalposts, would this risk turning a sensible financial decision into one that could could cost people tens of thousands of pounds in tax if that is moved into the IHT scope. So there are a few other unintended consequences of changing the taxation of pensions at death. It would hit the younger generations because that pot would be taxed. It would hit younger people inheriting those pensions. And I think it pretty much would kill off the pension freedoms. Is that a policy goal that the government wants to achieve? If it's even less attractive to move from DB to DC, some people might say that's a good thing, but it should be part of a thought-through wider policy initiative. It will impact the Treasury in terms of revenues. In terms of the financial decisions people make, the obvious consequence of increasing taxation on death would encourage more people to spend their pension pots during their lifetime, which wouldn't be too bad for the economy. But it might drive people, in the absence of any proper financial planning, to not think about having spare capital for social care if they're not able to plan properly, which a lot of people aren't. We've seen that. They're accessing their money too quickly. So we've got to be careful about that unintended consequence. I thought the ideas around national insurance were really quite interesting, actually. Delinking the subsidy, the link with national insurance, and applying a subsidy in terms of the fairness of the subsidy, extending it to other employers. But I think a word of caution here is that we have a workplace system where you really do need the buy-in from employers to pay more than the minimum. We want them to pay more than the automatic enrolment minimum. If the rules are changed and that subsidy is reduced, it could backfire if employers simply claw back the additional costs through reducing matching contributions, impacting adequacy levels further. And changing pension to national insurance to be paid on pension income, I think that could have consequences as well in terms of how do you apply that. Pensions, national insurance payments on pensions could increase the financial burden later in life for people, while at the same time the state pension age is going to be pushed out. Sorry, I'm speed reading through here. I'm trying to get through this. There's a lot to get through. I thought on the lifetime allowance and annual allowance, I thought the IFS was really right to look at the fairness between DC and DB with respect to the lifetime allowance. You only have to look where the burden of pension tax relief currently resides to see a chasm between the two systems in terms of fairness. One aspect I felt one trick missed in the report was the money purchase annual allowance. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. It's almost like a disincentive now. The government is trying to encourage over 50s to go back to work. But as soon as you have dipped into your pension pot and you're over 55, you could see your tax allowance slashed from £40,000 to £4,000 per year. That's a very big disincentive because you possibly won't get the full value of an employer contribution and your own to pension save and rebuild your pot. So I thought there was a trick there's a simple change that could be made to encourage lower earners to start saving again. So just to wrap up, I think the IFS is to be congratulated for shifting the direction of the debate on pensions tax relief. But generally, I think a lot of these changes would need an exceptionally long phase-in period to avoid unfairness. For example, the proposal to levy NICs on pension income. Many of today's pensioners did not enjoy NICs relief on their pension contributions, so this would be a form of double taxation. Saving and planning for retirement should be encouraged through the application of simple rules and regulations where the goalposts try and remain static for a few years. Now, I have to ask whether a long list of complex reforms implemented over a period of years or decades alongside wider changes to the tax system is what pension savers need. Thank you.
They can vote again now. Okay. We should tell them that.
Okay, so thank you ever so much, Carl, Isaac, David, Joe. That was absolutely fantastic. And we've run fairly long, but I hope you agree that there was nothing there that I would want to have missed, actually. Before we move on, you can now vote again to see whether you've changed your mind about anything. So same questions, but you're now far better informed. So will you come up with a different set of results? Before I ask the audience to come up with questions, Carl, clearly the key issue from David and Joe is the Daily Mail wouldn't wear it. It's retrospective. Even the modest, they really are relatively modest changes we're proposing to the lump sum, and even what to those of us look like the ludicrous treatment for inheritance tax and income tax for the under 75s. Even changing that will be too retrospective, I think, was broadly the message that we were getting. The depressing point is, if that's true, then that is a sort of that's telling us we really can't do very much at all, or at least we have to take a very, as Josephine said, a very, very, very long time to make any changes. What's your response to that? Other than I'm a nerd at the IFS and I don't really care what the Daily Mail says. But apart from that, what's your response?
So I don't need to win elections, so I don't need to worry about the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail has the headline on our tax-free lump sum proposal of backlash of biblical proportions. So we've clearly pressed a button there. You could have a transition. You could say, for example, the very light touch reform we have in our report is simply saying, look, let's just put a cap on the tax-free lump sum. Let's keep it as it is, but have a cap on how much you can take tax-free. We don't have a view on what the right number is, but we gave the example of £400,000 because it would still allow people to walk away with six figures free of income tax, which feels like still quite a good deal. And it would still mean that 80% of people approaching retirement, we think, would be unaffected by the change. If you didn't like that, you could say, well, what we'll do is look at your pension pot size today and we'll let you grandfather that. But as I said in my talk, if you start doing things like that, and there's an argument for it, it means it's not retrospective. You'd be saying it's a £400,000 cap unless you've already got over 400,000. But of course, it does mean that the generation of people who are approaching retirement with more than that get away without having to share any of the burden, and it's younger generations who suffer, and it's the younger generations where we might be more worried about. So it's a big trade-off between how much you really worry about the unfairness of hitting people who perhaps did put money into a pension, planning their divorce maybe, or their cruise, or their mortgage to be paid off, versus the unfairness of, if you've got something that's badly designed, that's overly generous, how long are you going to let that linger for?
Exactly. And those are the obvious trade-offs. It is, it's very striking that all of the changes made to pension taxation have hit people of working age, relatively well-off people of working age, to be fair, because it's reducing the annual and lifetime allowances to numbers which are still significant for most people. But all of that has hit people of working age, and it's retrospective in a different way. If you were planning to do all your saving in your 50s and now you can't, well, that in some sense is a degree of retrospection. But it's very helpful for us to hear the sort of the political response to what we thought were relatively modest proposals.
I can give context. Before our talks, 48% of the people who voted in this room thought the tax-free lump sum should be reformed, and it's now up to 62%.
Excellent. So IFS 1, David and Josephine 0.
Not many Daily Mail readers.
Fantastic. We got any questions? If you'd say who you are. Well, there's. I know who you are, Edward Troop.
Edward Troop, former civil servant. Worked with David in 2016 on these failed reforms. Great event. Normally I come to IFS events and IFS puts out some really bold things, and I sat in the audience being extremely cautious. You set out some quite cautious reforms. David's been the one who's been even more cautious and concerned. I had a question actually, or a challenge for Carl, which sort of goes to the boldness or lack of it. Carl started off saying pensions need subsidies. Now, I agree that pension savings should be taxed well and properly, consistent with everything else, but when you talk about subsidies and try and use the tax system, it generally goes horribly wrong, and that's what we've been seeing today. But I'm sort of challenging why pensions need subsidies, and also challenging the lack of any real mention of the state pension age. Because if there were adequate state pensions which allowed pensioners to live sufficiently on state pensions, it seems to me the case for any pension, any subsidy of pension saving, is quite hard to make. So there's a bit of a challenge for Carl there. And the reason I put this challenge because it is the sort of IFS point, but also if this isn't going to be reformed in the next 5-10 years, it would be quite nice to have a sort of bold picture of where the combination of state pension provision and the need for tax subsidies, as opposed to just taxing pensions right, should lie.
So just to be clear, you're not thinking of EET as a tax subsidy, you're thinking of more than that as a
I'm thinking, I think that was Carl's case,
indeed.
that there was a tax subsidy, and I'm challenging the case for it, because there is a paternalistic sort of sense behind that. Well, we need to encourage people to save because they're too stupid to save for themselves, but that's clearly influenced by the existence or expectation of a state pension.
Okay, Carl, in a remarkable turnaround, Edward Troop is saying that we're not being radical enough.
Yeah. So the case for a subsidy, I think that you might be worried about people underproviding for their own sake, so that would be a paternalistic argument. Maybe they're shying away from difficult decisions, maybe they discounting the future very heavily. Maybe you're worried about them wanting to drop back on state support once they get to retirement, so you see it as a way of protecting the state from, for example, a bigger housing benefit bill when they get to retirement. So I think they're the arguments for state intervention. I do agree that actually you need to think carefully about what's the best way of intervening. You've got a state pension lever, you've got an automatic enrolment lever, you've got provision of information, education. There are other changes you can make. So pension tax relief is just one lever the government has. It might be a combination of levers that's particularly important, but that would be the case I would make for having something. And as I said, we didn't set out in this report to question the kind of let's question the overall level of subsidy. We set out to see whether how it was being balanced. Our system, as Isaac said, would allow policymakers to directly change the subsidy that's provided to all individuals on their pension saving, which would be a constant proportion for everybody. It would allow the government to change the particular subsidy it's providing employers to contribute into pensions, and those would be separate parameters from the income tax rate or the national insurance rate. So a future government could come along and change those subsidies, make them bigger, smaller, as it saw fit.
David, Joe, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah,
Joe?
I'd just like to bring in the situation in France and other countries that have got a heavy reliance on the state pension. It's really, really difficult to make changes to their state pension because of the reliance people have on it. That's why people are out on the streets in France raising the state pension age to 60? A couple of years, much lower than we are. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Well, also, I suppose, make the point that the Anglo-Saxon way is generally not to save a lot of money. That's not, we are consume, we consume rather than save. And I do wonder I'm actually sympathetic to the view that some state intervention to try to increase people's own sort of resilience, to try to sort of move them in the direction of building up their own resources to protect them at a later date, rather than necessarily future taxpayers always taking the burden. So I think my question is whether what we do at the moment is necessarily the most effective way of changing behaviour. And partly, I think I would question whether tax is necessarily the right lever, and we should talk. If we're talking about a subsidy, in my sense, it's something that Edward sort of pointed out numerous times over the years to me when I was a junior minister and he was a senior official. And that was very much the nature of the relationship. What was that? Tax is not always the right answer, and you might be more effective in changing behaviour in having a subsidy which is clearly a subsidy and having it as spending, in the terms of matched amount, rather than something which is tax relief.
It's lady in green there.
Charlotte Moore, freelance journalist. I want to pick up on Joe's point about your proposal of applying employer NICs to their contributions, and pick up on her point about the dangers of actually reducing the level of employer contributions, because we're so reliant on that. And I mean, I know you're not talking about tax, but you started out by talking about contribution levels and how low they are. I mean, there's a really strong case that's emerging for auto-escalation, given that most people think contribution levels should be double where they are. They should be at 16%, not 8%. So I'm wondering if you're creating an issue there, and also it seems slightly one hand giving with one and taking away with the other if you're saying apply NICs to employer contributions yet create a subsidy, and also self-confessed skin in the game as a self-employed person. How do you try and address that issue? If I save into my pension, I have no employer to match my contributions. So about 4 different questions, sorry.
Carl? Isaac?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think you sort of, to some extent, said what I was going to say, which is that, yes, I mean, we do recognise there is a danger to having this very sudden change in the amount of subsidy that's provided to employers, and that's why we were saying, that there is this option to have this new employer subsidy, and that that can apply more broadly. And that clearly is the case, that will still suffer from some of the problems that the current subsidy system has, where it's only subsidising employer contributions, and therefore you do cut out those who don't have employers. I think that's a completely fair point to make.
Nothing, Bill?
I guess, I mean, if you put the employer NICs on and you introduce a subsidy at 13.8, just to reiterate what Isaac said, that is giving with one hand, taking with another. It does mean that no employer is immediately made worse off from the deal, and it does mean that all of a sudden we're subsidising all employers for their contributions at the same rate, which includes the smallest employers, which currently don't benefit at all from an employer NICs rate because we've exempted them from employer NICs. And there's a load of other cases as well where we've taken employers out of employer NICs, and I don't think anyone's ever sat down and gone, oh yeah, we're taking them out of employer NICs, that reduces the incentive they have to save in a pension, but that's fine. I don't think we've really sat down and thought that we think that people who employ a lot of apprentices, people who set up businesses in free ports, for example, all shouldn't get the same subsidy. So I think it's another example of why would we link our employer subsidy to the employer NICs rate when you have desires to, for example, cut the employer NICs rate in free ports or for small employers. Why not have a straightforward subsidy, apply it in a uniform way? Now, if we don't like that because it's not helping the self-employed, then I think we do need perhaps a different solution for the self-employed. And I think we do need some policy attention there. I don't have a great solution, but I think it is very, very striking how engagement with pensions amongst the self-employed has just fallen so sharply over such a long period of time. It's really quite amazing. And I think that does require some policy attention.
There are lots of, I'm going to take a couple of questions, in fact 3 at once. There's 2 gentlemen here and Michael Johnson up there.
Thank you for all of that. John Spain, Law for Life, formerly GOD. I quite liked a lot of that.
Don't sound so surprised.
Yes, partly because I saw some of it going back to pre-2006. If we had a suitable transition period, a long transition period, it could work, and we could have, for example, employee NICs not levied on anybody who'd already retired before a given date. We've had that before. The Inland Revenue have had plenty of occasions when the conditions, the terms have changed from generation to generation, and they can handle it. What really worries me is if this sort of system were adopted, I fear that the politicians and the civil servants would compare the tax reliefs in this year against the tax received from pensioners in this year, and that's just the wrong comparison. You need to compare tax received in this year from current pensioners with tax subsidies, tax exemptions from previous years.
So I think we need to, so if you've got a question.
Sorry, I'd like to know how IFS think that would work.
I think so. That is a very good question, and we'll come to that. But can we go to the gentleman behind you?
Yeah, thank you, Rob Yule from ABI. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. Very thorough report. I agree with a lot of Joe's comments. My question is, if there was a bespoke system for pension subsidies rather than linking it to tax incentives, do you think that might make them more cuttable and more subject to political whim?
Good question. And back here.
Michael Johnson. Another plea, just to forget all about connecting pensions incentives with taxation. But David, whilst we've been looking at a sort of bifurcation between EET and TEE, you did introduce something which is actually EEE for anyone under the age of 40, which is a lifetime ISA. And I'm staggered as to how little conversation or focus there is on this, because essentially the 25% upfront bonus is economically equivalent to basic rate tax relief. So I'm just curious, you took that step, and that whilst you pondered a TEE, you kind of made an even further step, and then silence, and obviously Brexit and so on. So I'm curious as to whether, from your perspective, the lifetime ISA is perhaps just viewed as an experiment to gauge public opinion, or worse, the opinion of the pensions industry.
Lovely. So, question on LISAs, which we've done very little work on, I think it's fair to say. A question on how accounting for tax relief works and how we make sure that that is done properly. And then a question really saying, well, if we decouple the subsidy from the tax system, is there not a chance that it'll just get mucked around with even more than it gets mucked around with at the moment? David, do you want to start?
Yeah, let me pick up two of this. I mean, Michael's point on LISAs, absolutely, it was testing the water. It was a sense of, well, what could we do, and could this be the basis of something, a bigger reform in future? So by the time we got to the end of the process, we felt, we think this is a really interesting idea, but you need a consensus, you need things to sort of build from it. Obviously, that was, I think, what announced in March 2016. Within a few months, we had a different chancellor, and although I was still in the Treasury, I was no longer sort of doing the sort of tax job. I think there possibly have been attempts to abolish the LISA on occasions. Whilst I was still in the Treasury, I was always against anything of that sort, because I think it would be interesting to see how it all works out. But it has rather disappeared from the debate. So I sort of fully accept that point. But yes, it was dipping a toe in the water. And just on this point about whether matched amounts, could they be sort of fiddled around with and so on. I mean, yes, in the sense of you've got ministers able to make judgments on sort of public spending, and it's kind of more flexible, but it's also more transparent, and you could equally see pressure to increase spending on it being greater. So I think it's hard to tell how the politics of it would play out. But my argument is that it's kind of clearer and more transparent.
Joe?
Yeah, I'd like to take John's question and Michael's, just to start with John's about that system, the reforms actually working over a long transition period. The immediate thing that jumps out to me, red flag, is errors in administration. We've already seen that in the state pension. GMP reconciliation, there are still paper-based records in boxes. I would be terribly worried about wrong information and people paying different amounts. You've got pension income, different parts of it subject to NI and other parts to it. We don't want that. You just want to keep things simple. Secondly, to the point about the lifetime ISA, I'm glad you brought that up, Michael, because I think it just illustrates that tax is really poorly understood by the public, because if people knew that there was this extra way that they could get a 25% top up on saving for retirement, why aren't they taking advantage of it? Just because it's not promoted. I think there has been an under-appreciation and explanation of the ways that people get confused in the system. That is sitting there. People can take advantage of that, but not enough people are doing it.
Carl, do you want to say something both on either LISAs or on this issue of accounting?
Yeah, so certainly on John's accounting point, I completely agree that you want to compare the relief that somebody got with the tax they subsequently pay, and that's the kind of model we tried to build and use in our report precisely does that. And I also agree that the move to give people upfront NICS relief but impose national insurance contributions on their retirement withdrawals, I think I would agree that we don't want to put NICS on retirement incomes at the full rate immediately. I think it would have to be phased in. I think there would be a case for starting with some level of national insurance even for those retired. And I think I'm going to give an example of where there's been a bit of a windfall gain for some. So, for example, if you're 30 years old in 1990, busily putting money into a pension, you might be getting basic rate relief. You might have been thinking, well, I'll pay basic rate tax on that when I retire. Basic rate of tax is 25%. You're now in retirement or approaching retirement, you're going to pay basic rate tax of 20%. So there's a windfall gain on your pension pot. So I think you can justify a charge, not necessarily 12%, but a charge. And I think that you need to think about how some of those reforms in the last 20 years or so have actually led to some gains as well as some losses. On Rob's point about the subsidy and would it be more cuttable, it would be more transparent and more clear. I think I'd give the example though that the decision in the mini budget to get rid of the health and social care levy cut the subsidy on employer pension contributions by about 10% relative to what it would have been. So it was cut in a very untransparent way. So I'm not sure which way it goes. It depends whether you think tax rates are likely to fall or go up in future, I think.
We're getting towards the end, but I'll take a last round of questions. There's a gentleman right at the back who's been trying to ask a question. There's a lady back there, and I'll take the gentleman at the front. I'm afraid we'll have to stop there.
Thank you. Tim Gosling. Just wanted to bring in sort of a related topic of Steve Webb's reforms of the state pension several years back, where DWP did something fairly radical and redistributive that was probably politically achievable because it didn't affect people in the here and now. It only affected people that are really quite a long way from retirement in terms of what their overall entitlement was going to end up being. And thinking about that, and thinking about PCLS, how far does the sort of Webb model of reform is that an iron law of the reform of pensions entitlements and pensions taxation? Can you only really do radical change if you're not affecting people in the here and now? Okay. Or are more radical things really possible?
Right. Okay, so a question about the Webb model. I've not heard it called that before. Lady here, right over the other side, I'm afraid. And then, well, actually, why don't we take the gentleman right at the front on your way round? Yeah. Sorry for those I haven't been able to get to, but we're already
I have to rethink my question now. What I was going to say is there's a sense that there's so many moving parts in what we've been discussing today, millions of them, and there are so many unintended consequences from the past and going forward into the future. But what it seems to me to amount to is that you end up with a pension which is based on what the system is prepared to give you, and it's becoming increasingly detached from the money you put into the system. And I'll give you an example here. If you take labour participation and the people who are able to even save for a pension or not save for a pension, we've got huge numbers of people who are economically inactive. But it seems to be all these tweaks to the system doesn't really address that fundamental problem that there are huge numbers of people who are unable to save.
A question there about the number of people unable to save, and then lady at the back.
My question's kind of related to the question before about Steve Webb and also to Edward Troop's point about the state pension. I wanted to talk about NSCs and the popular imagination of the relationship between NICs and taxation. Because in the popular imagination, NICs are contributions to the state pension. I have tried for years to get across to people that they're just general taxation and they pay for a range of things.
So have we.
And I know you have too, but as you know, it is extraordinarily difficult to shift that perception. And so any tinkering with anything that involves NICs is going to be seen as tinkering with the state pension. In this case, if you're actually raising more money from NICs, and in particular, if you are moving towards charging NICs on pensions in withdrawal, In other words, you're moving on to charging pensioners NICs. I think you're going to trigger the Daily Express.
Oh God, the threats grow. This is going to be the last round of comments from everyone on the panel, so feel free to range. Well, don't take too long, but feel free to range reasonably widely. But we've had a question. Essentially, I think the first question there was, basically, do you just have to wait for a generation or two before you can make real change to any of this? I mean, which it would be depressing if true, but I get the sense that Joe and David think probably. Second question really is, well, what about those who haven't got any money during their working life? The third question is again rather a question of doom. We also taken in by what national insurance contributions are, that there's no hope. I'll start with Isaac, then go to Joe and David, and give Carl the last word.
Yeah, well, I think the one I was just going to pick up on was this question of national insurance. I mean, it really, really is worth emphasising that the link between national insurance and any kind of benefit you get in retirement or anywhere else is really, really been very much weakened over time. It's basically just another bit of income tax, right? And the more we get to treating it that way, and even preferably turning it into just one tax, the better, frankly. So if anything, I think we'd see sort of that alignment as a positive rather than a negative. And I mean, clearly there are perception issues there, but fortunately I'm not a politician, so I don't have to worry about them.
I'll just pick up on Tim's point about change and whether it can sort of be, the losses can be pushed into the future. I recall the state pension did have some immediate winners and losers, except people didn't know it. I mean, the changes that came into effect really quickly was the increase in the qualifying years from 30 to 35. You had to work longer for your pension. There was a minimum of 10 years that you had to contribute for it. And of course, spouses could no longer inherit the state pension. Those were immediate changes that came in that people just didn't know it. Maybe that was the trick. As to the issue with contributions and how to encourage people to sort of lowest earners to save more, I think that's all going to come through increased contributions through AE. I mean, there are reforms that have been on the table since 2017 to expand automatic enrolment to get people paying in from the first pound that they save. But those changes, we don't even have a timetable for that yet. And the longer we don't do anything about it, the more people will sleepwalk into disappointment.
First of all, on Francis's point on NICs, I very much agree with what Francis and the IFS have been saying for years. I was quite interested in exploring what we could do to bring income tax and NICs together in terms of sort of long-term view. It was a great conspiracy against the public, but it's for a government that's scratching around for necessary revenue. It's probably not going to be the priority anytime soon, because probably taxes are going to have to go up, and it probably will have to be NICs as being the least politically painful way of doing so. But no, it upsets the sort of purist in me about that, and it does then have unintended sort of consequences, as we see on this. The web model, look, I think probably there are some things that you can do sooner rather than later that bring some immediate benefit, but you do have to just tread pretty carefully. You don't want to lose a legal case on this, and then you really are in deep trouble, and it can be sort of politically difficult. I thought Carl made a very good case in terms of could you have a sort of a lower rate of NICs and increase over time. That I found that sort of quite persuasive, but very often the best way of landing a reform is for people not to feel it's going to affect them for some time, and then before you know it, they do. I mean, a little bit like increasing the state pension age actually wasn't a big issue, hasn't been a big issue in this country, but it's been announced because it's so far off. The final point in terms of unable to save. Joe's right about auto enrolment being the key here, but of course, in the end, I mean, I'd be corrected by the IFS, but as more contributions go in from employers, in the end, it will be the employees who will be paying that in lower pay, lower take-home pay, that the burden will ultimately lie on employees. But that is the way in which we have remarkably successfully got some people who would otherwise not be saving very much, saving much more than they previously would have done.
So just very briefly, I think lots of the questions and some of the earlier questions are very much focused on the transition and some of the really difficult things about getting that right. And I think lots of people emphasising you can't do this or you can't do that or it's not possible to do that. And I guess if that means you have to go really, really slowly, if that's the consequence, I think my instinct then is you want to start pretty soon then, because at least you'll get to your destination at some point. And maybe it also relates to concerns about undersaving and the automatic enrolment reforms. Maybe actually getting them legislated, but just moving them very gradually in would be the way to go, rather than leaving them parked. And then it's always going to be the case that people will say, well, maybe now's not the moment for employers or employees to be dipping more into their pockets. Maybe you just need to do these things really quite gradually, but do start early then if you want to get anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, so patience, it seems, is required. I mean, it is. What worries me about all of that is that in the end, the consequence is always that the younger generation end up coughing up, and the older generation got off scot-free, and that's just how it always has worked and will continue to work, it seems to me. But the generation in here has now earned a drink. Where are the drinks, Greg?
In the same room that the refreshments are.
Okay, so we have all earned a drink upstairs. Thank you ever so much. You can come and quiz this lot further if you didn't get to ask your question earlier. But thank you. Join me, please, in thanking a fantastic couple of speakers.